June 7, 1944. The gray dawn over the English Channel carries the weight of history. A restless sea heaves beneath the silhouettes of strange floating giants, hollow blocks of concrete, vast steel skeletons, and roadways that bend with the tide. From the air it looks like chaos. Ships anchored in lines, men shouting over the roar of winches, cranes lowering strange assemblies into the water. But to the men of the Royal Engineers and the crews of 1,000 tugs, it is an act of creation. A harbor is being born, not carved into rock, but forged upon the waves. A cold wind slices through their oilskins as waves crash against the rising walls. The channel is merciless, yet inside the growing ring of concrete, the sea begins to calm. The first landing craft edge closer, offloading ammunition, fuel, and tanks, the lifeblood of an invading army. Behind them, the smoke of Normandy still rises on the horizon. The invasion has begun, but without this harbor, it will die where it stands. For Britain's engineers, this is the culmination of years of secrecy, vision, and defiance. An invisible harbor built to do the impossible, to invade Fortress Europe. By the summer of 1943, the Allied war effort stood at a crossroads. The victories in North Africa and Sicily had proven that the combined forces of Britain and the United States could seize territory, but only when they had a port to feed their armies. On the European mainland, it was a different story. Every major harbor from Dunkirk to Brest had been fortified into concrete fortresses under Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Deep-water ports, the arteries of supply, were ringed with heavy guns, mines, and underwater obstacles. The lesson of Dieppe in August 1942 was seared into every planner's mind. Trying to capture a port head-on was suicide. When the Allies began planning the invasion of France, the single greatest question wasn't how to land troops. It was how to sustain them. Military logistics was the silent giant behind every battle. Generals and engineers calculated the staggering requirements of a modern army. Thousands of tons of food, fuel, ammunition, and equipment needed each day to keep the offensive alive. Without secure harbors, the entire operation, code-named Overlord, would collapse within weeks. In London, Winston Churchill understood this with a clarity few possessed. He had seen wars won and lost on the back of supply lines. In a moment of characteristic urgency, he sent a note to his chiefs of staff in May 1942. It contained just a few lines, written in his impatient scrawl. Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. It was an impossible demand, and yet the British engineers set to work without hesitation. The concept was radical. Instead of capturing ports, they would build artificial ones, entire harbors that could be towed across the English Channel and assembled off the invasion beaches. The project would combine the disciplines of naval architecture, civil engineering, and sheer creative daring. The plan was to construct 2 complete Mulberry Harbors, one for the British at Arromanches, Gold Beach, and one for the Americans at Omaha Beach. Each harbor would consist of 4 main components. First were the Phoenix caissons, massive hollow concrete blocks, some as large as apartment buildings, to form the breakwater walls. Next were bombardons, floating steel structures that absorbed wave energy offshore. Then came the whale roadways, long floating bridges linking the moored pierheads to the beaches, flexible enough to ride the tides. Finally, there were the spud pierheads, steel platforms supported by legs that could raise and lower with the sea, allowing ships to unload regardless of tide conditions. Designing these systems meant confronting the most relentless engineer of all, the sea itself. Every prototype failed before it succeeded. Waves tore at moorings, tides shifted structures off their bearings, and salt water devoured untested metals. The test sites along Britain's southern coast became laboratories of trial and error. Engineers and laborers worked day and night under blackout conditions, the thunder of waves masking the clang of steel. The urgency grew with each passing month. The Germans were still strengthening their Atlantic defenses, pouring millions of tons of concrete into bunkers and gun emplacements. Time was not a luxury. The invasion timetable was tightening. Behind closed doors, Churchill demanded progress reports weekly. His energy, though at times impatient, drove the project forward. He had once written that wars were not won by generals alone, but by the sweat of the craftsmen. Mulberry would prove him right. As 1943 drew to a close, the Allied engineers faced a staggering logistical task, not just to design a floating harbor, but to manufacture one on a national scale. Hundreds of shipyards, steelworks, and concrete plants across Britain were repurposed. The project remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Even workers who shaped the massive caissons were often told they were making floating breakwaters for future docks, unaware of their true purpose. In these months of planning and construction, Britain became an island-sized workshop. Every river mouth and coastal yard buzzed with activity. Men and women, draftsmen, welders, and dockyard crews labored under the same goal: to build something the world had never seen, and to do it before the tide of war turned against them. The storm of ideas and steel was gathering, and soon the world would witness its most daring creation. The only way to land an army in Europe was not to capture a port, but to build one. By early 1944, Britain's coastline had become a secret empire of engineering. Along estuaries, docks, and shipyards, from the Thames to the Clyde, an army of craftsmen worked in silence. Concrete forms rose from tidal flats like gray cliffs, while welders' torches lit the night in bursts of blue fire. The project now had a name whispered through planning rooms and naval yards: Mulberry. Behind it stood thousands of minds and hands, each devoted to one impossible goal: to build a harbor that could be towed to France and survive the fury of the Channel. At Garliston in Scotland, engineers tested scaled prototypes in bitter winds and driving rain. There, Royal Engineer Officer Alan Beckett designed the flexible steel whale roadways, floating spans connected by bridge-like joints that could rise and fall with the tide. His system would link ships anchored offshore to pierheads, which themselves were balanced on adjustable steel legs. It was an elegant solution to a brutal problem. Every wave, every gust of wind tested the structure's resilience. Nearby, naval officers studied the towing mechanics, how to guide colossal concrete caissons, some weighing over 6,000 tons, across unpredictable seas. The effort demanded coordination on an industrial scale. Every major British port contributed. On the Clyde, firms poured the Phoenix caissons. On the Tyne and Thames, shipyards built the Whales and Spuds. Across southern England, smaller contractors constructed bombarded floating breakwaters, steel cruciform structures shaped like enormous X's that would absorb wave energy before it reached the shore. Each component had to fit precisely into the others, like pieces of an enormous floating puzzle. But the real challenge was not just construction. It was secrecy. Operation Bodyguard, the grand Allied deception plan, had to ensure that German intelligence never guessed the scale or purpose of Mulberry. A false narrative was spread through fake signals and dummy preparations, suggesting that the invasion would strike the Pas de Calais. Meanwhile, along England's southern coast, completed caissons were disguised under camouflage netting or moored in remote estuaries. To a German reconnaissance pilot, they looked like simple barges or obsolete ships. As the spring of 1944 approached, the final rehearsals began. The English Channel became a proving ground. Tugboats tested towing lines in rough weather. Engineers monitored how the giant blocks handled the waves. Some prototypes cracked or shifted, others rode the sea perfectly. Lessons were learned fast, and always under the looming pressure of time. The Allied command had set June 5th as D-Day. There could be no delay. Every component of Mulberry had to be finished, tested, and staged for departure by then. In staging areas like Selseybill and Dungeness, the Channel's horizon turned into a surreal sight. Rows of floating roads, concrete monoliths, and anchored pontoons waiting for their moment. The operation required over 200 tugs to tow the sections across the sea, a convoy of harbors moving silently toward destiny. Men joked that Britain was invading France with cement. But beneath the humor was fear. The sea could turn violent without warning, and every failure risked hundreds of lives. The engineers and sailors understood the stakes. Without the Mulberry Harbors, the invasion beaches would be starved of supplies within days. The British and American high commands calculated that the Allied armies needed to unload roughly 12,000 tons of cargo daily in the early weeks, a figure no beach operation in history had ever achieved without a port. And so, under tight security and immense pressure, the pieces came together. By May 1944, 2 entire artificial harbors lay ready. Each would be towed across the channel immediately after D-Day, one destined for Omaha Beach, the other for Arromanches. They were more than machines. They were monuments to imagination and endurance. In the days before the invasion, Churchill visited the South Coast and watched the sea-tested structures being prepared. He was silent for a long time, then reportedly said, "This is the work that will carry us to victory." It was true. The ships, men, and plans for D-Day were essential, but without these floating ports, victory could not land and stay ashore. As the final convoys formed off the English coast, fog and tension settled over the channel. The engineers stood by their creations, exhausted yet proud. Somewhere across the water, Europe waited, and with it, the destiny of the war. The next morning, the harbor that would change the course of history began its slow journey toward Normandy. War is remembered through battles and generals, but the Mulberry Harbor was a triumph of the unsung, men who fought the sea with steel and calculation. They were dock workers, draftsmen, engineers, and sailors, many too old or unfit for frontline combat, but indispensable to victory. They worked in freezing rain and choking fog, with little rest and less recognition. Each section they built had to fit perfectly with the next, because a single warped joint could doom the whole structure once it reached France. Many knew nothing of the invasion's timing, only that what they were making had to survive the fury of the channel. Their reward was not medals, but the knowledge that if their harbor failed, thousands of men might die stranded on an open beach. In every bolt tightened and cable welded was an act of quiet courage, one that would never appear in a dispatch. From a tactical standpoint, the Mulberry concept was the beating heart of Operation Overlord's design. The Allies had learned the hard way that armies did not move on bravery, but on tonnage. In Tunisia and Sicily, the delay in securing ports had stalled operations for weeks. Normandy offered no such luxury. The invasion beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were broad, shallow, and easily disrupted by tides. Landing craft could deliver men and light vehicles, but not the immense flow of tanks, trucks, and supplies that would follow. Without a harbor, the beachhead would choke within days. Mulberry solved this by transforming the shoreline into a living port. Ships could unload in deeper water, cargo could roll straight onto whale roadways, and the rhythm of war, the supply convoys, the ammunition runs, the fuel trucks, could flow unbroken from ship to shore. It was a logistical ballet choreographed to the pulse of the tide. Technologically, Mulberry represented one of the most complex feats of modular engineering ever attempted. Each Phoenix caisson, cast in British shipyards and river estuaries, was a concrete monolith, some nearly 60 meters long, 18 meters high, and weighing more than 6,000 tons. They had to float when towed, then sink in perfect formation to form a breakwater wall. The whale roadways were flexible steel spans supported by floating pontoons, capable of bending with the waves without snapping. The spud pierheads rested on adjustable legs, designed to rise and fall with the tide through a system of hydraulic jacks, a concept adapted from offshore drilling platforms. Surrounding it all were bombarded breakwaters, vast floating barriers shaped like cruciforms to absorb the sea's energy. Each part was a marvel. Together, they formed an ecosystem of engineering. And unlike most weapons of war, this one had to fight not a human enemy, but nature itself. Even the assembly plan bordered on insanity. Each harbor consisted of over 600,000 tons of concrete and steel, towed across one of the most unpredictable seas on Earth, into a battle zone still echoing with gunfire. The tugs would operate under air attack, in choppy waters with only rudimentary navigation aids. The operation had to be synchronized to the minute. If one section arrived late or drifted off course, the entire structure could fail. Yet the engineers accepted this with professional calm. They knew the calculations, they trusted the physics, and they understood that in war, perfection was not an option, only persistence. But the human toll of Mulberry went beyond its construction. Many of those who worked the towing operations were merchant seamen, already hardened by years of Atlantic convoy duty. They faced the same dangers again: mines, submarines, and the cruel weather of the Channel. Some tugs vanished during the crossing, their caissons sinking with them. Others arrived battered but intact, greeted by cheers from soldiers already ashore. For those men, the harbor was no longer a secret. It was a lifeline. They saw tanks rolling down the floating roads they had once welded together, and they understood, in the most visceral way, that their craft had become the bridge between invasion and victory. The Mulberry Harbors were not just engineering projects. They were embodiments of Allied unity. British designers built them, American forces relied on them, and Canadian troops helped secure the beaches they served. Every nation in the coalition had a hand in its creation or protection. It was a physical manifestation of cooperation, steel proof that the Allies could combine not just armies, but intellect and industry toward a single goal. Now, as the floating fortress neared the coast of Normandy, the men who had conceived it held their breath. They had beaten time, secrecy, and skepticism. But the one test that remained was the oldest adversary of all: the sea. Leadership drove the Mulberry Project as much as engineering did. Winston Churchill's insistence on unconventional solutions set the tone from the beginning. He had a long memory of amphibious disasters. Gallipoli in 1915 haunted him still, and he knew that landing without infrastructure was an invitation to failure. When many within the War Office dismissed the idea of floating harbors as absurd, Churchill overruled them. His note, "They must float up and down with the tide," was not a suggestion, but a command. Beneath him, leaders like Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, General Sir Frederick Morgan, and Lord Mountbatten shepherded the concept from sketch to steel. Each knew the stakes. Overlord could not succeed without the promise of sustained supply. But leadership also came from the quiet corners of the project. Men like Alan Beckett, whose uncelebrated brilliance in mechanical design turned theory into practicality. There were hundreds like him: anonymous civil engineers, dockyard foremen, and junior officers who found ways to make impossible components align. In a war often defined by charisma and rhetoric, Mulberry was leadership by intellect, perseverance, and faith in the men holding the tools. On the other side of the Channel, the German command watched the unfolding invasion with confusion and disbelief. When the Allies landed on June 6, 1944, German intelligence had no idea that an entire port was following them. Reconnaissance flights reported strange convoys of large objects being towed across the Channel, but their purpose went unrecognized. The German naval staff assumed they were barges or fuel tanks. Even as the caissons began to sink into place off the beaches, Luftwaffe analysts underestimated their permanence, thinking they were temporary landing pontoons. It was a fatal misjudgment. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been designed to destroy any landing force before it could secure a port. Yet within a week, the Allies had built one instead. German coastal batteries tried to shell the new structures, but their range was limited, and Allied air superiority smothered any sustained attack. What the Germans did not understand, and never truly recovered from, was that Mulberry had removed one of their greatest advantages: the geography of defense. The Atlantic Wall had been designed for static war. Mulberry turned it into a relic overnight. Beyond the tactical victory lay a deeper moral dimension. Mulberry was more than a feat of engineering. It was a moral answer to despair. Every beam welded and every caisson cast was an act of defiance against tyranny. Britain, battered by years of bombing, had transformed its industrial ruins into the foundation of liberation. The harbor symbolized not destruction, but reconstruction, a floating testament to the power of ingenuity over fear. Its creation embodied a collective belief that war could be fought not just with guns, but with ideas. In a conflict that had consumed millions of lives, Mulberry offered a glimpse of humanity's creative spirit even in its darkest hour. Engineers, soldiers, and sailors alike found purpose in the knowledge that what they built would save others. The harbor's silent strength carried a kind of redemption, not in words, but in function. At the strategic level, Mulberry redefined the way wars would be fought. Before Normandy, amphibious invasions depended entirely on capturing established ports, a vulnerability that often dictated where and when an army could strike. After Mulberry, the sea itself became a platform. The Allies had proven that they could bring their own infrastructure wherever it was needed. This flexibility reshaped Allied planning across Europe. It meant that logistics could keep pace with momentum, that generals could think offensively rather than defensively. The lessons of Mulberry would ripple through military doctrine long after the guns fell silent. And yet, for all its scale and success, Mulberry remained an unsung marvel. The men who conceived it returned to their anonymity when the war ended. There were no parades for the engineers who fought the tides, no medals for the welders who labored through sleepless nights. But every ton of cargo, every tank that rolled inland toward Caen, every soldier who fought with food and ammunition supplied through that floating harbor, all of it bore their invisible signature. In June 1944, as the tides turned and the wind began to rise, the Mulberry Harbors faced the one enemy no general could command. The sea would test every calculation, every joint, and every ounce of courage that had gone into their making. Within days, the greatest storm in decades was gathering beyond the horizon, and the fate of the entire invasion would soon rest on whether this harbor of steel and concrete could survive the wrath of nature itself. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in history unfolds across the Normandy coast. From the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc to the sands of Gold Beach, the horizon is filled with ships, smoke, and gunfire. Behind the spectacle of men storming the beaches lies a quieter convoy, invisible to the headlines, the Mulberry Harbors. As soldiers fight inland, these strange floating structures begin their own invasion. From ports along southern England, hundreds of tugs set out towing vast sections of concrete, steel, and timber. Some carry the colossal Phoenix caissons, others the whale roadways and spud pierheads. The convoys move slowly, barely 6 knots, across a gray and unpredictable channel. For the men aboard, the journey is tense and silent. The sea is restless, the sky heavy with threat. They are not warriors but craftsmen entering a battlefield. On June 7th, as the beaches of Normandy groan under the weight of the landing, the first Mulberry units begin to arrive. The British harbor is destined for Arromanches behind Gold Beach. The American one will be assembled off Omaha. The scale of the operation is staggering. Each harbor requires hundreds of floating units to be positioned with precision. The Phoenix caissons sunk in tight arcs to form breakwaters. The bombardment barriers anchored further out. The whale roadways stretched between pierheads and the shore. It is a choreography of anchors, chains, and tides. Men in small boats guide massive structures into place with hand signals and shouted orders, working under enemy aircraft and the ever-present threat of mines. The beaches remain chaotic, but within days the outlines of 2 new ports emerge from the surf. By June 14th, the British Mulberry B at Arromanches is operational. A floating roadway connects ships offshore to the beach, and the first trucks roll ashore carrying ammunition and fuel. The scene is surreal. Tanks rumbling over steel bridges that rise and fall with the tide, cranes unloading cargo from ships that sway gently in the surf. Soldiers who had expected to wade through mud now drive onto firm ground. To them, the harbor seems like a miracle, an impossible city on the sea. Admiral Ramsay, who had masterminded the naval invasion, calls it an engineering victory of the first order. Meanwhile, the American Mulberry A off Omaha is also taking shape, though under far greater strain. The beaches there are narrower, the surf heavier, and German defenses more brutal. Still, by June 16th, both harbors are functioning. Supplies flow ashore in record quantities: tanks, artillery, food, and the endless fuel cans that feed the war machine. The system works. The Allies have not just invaded, they are sustaining the invasion. But the English Channel has never been kind to those who underestimate it. On June 18th, the wind begins to shift. A low-pressure system forms in the Atlantic and moves eastward with alarming speed. By the morning of June 19th, the calm seas that had cradled Mulberry turn violent. Waves climb past 4 meters. Wind gusts tear at moorings and rip cables from their anchors. Men rush to secure the roadways, tightening bolts, reinforcing pontoons, and praying the structures will hold. The storm intensifies hour by hour. By nightfall, the beaches vanish beneath a wall of foam and spray. For 3 days, the tempest rages, the worst summer storm to hit the Channel in 20 years. Ships drag their anchors and collide. Landing craft are hurled onto the beaches like toys. The Phoenix caissons strain under the relentless pounding. Some crack, others shift from their foundations. At Omaha, the American Mulberry bears the full brunt of the gale. Whale roadways snap like twigs. Spud pier heads collapse into the surf. Men cling to the wreckage, powerless against nature's assault. By the time the storm passes on June 22nd, the American harbor lies in ruins. Mulberry A is beyond repair. At Arromanches, the story is different. The British Mulberry survives, battered, flooded, but intact. Better site selection, deeper anchorage, and luck have spared it the same fate. Engineers and sailors work frantically, pumping water from caissons, replacing twisted spans, and salvaging what remains. The sea has spoken, but not yet triumphed. As the waves subside, commanders face a critical decision. The Americans, unwilling to divert resources from the front, decide to abandon their shattered harbor. The British, under Admiral Talbot and a determined corps of Royal Engineers, resolve to fight for theirs. Every bolt tightened, every beam reinforced becomes an act of defiance. A battle not of bullets, but of endurance. By June 23rd, a semblance of order returns. Damaged roadways are reconnected, pierheads realigned. Against all odds, ships once again begin unloading cargo through the surviving harbor at Arromanches. The Mulberry stands as the last artificial port in operation, the sole lifeline of the Allied beachhead. And yet, the greatest test still lies ahead. The invasion has survived the storm, but the question remains: can this wounded harbor sustain an entire army across the continent of Europe? When the winds finally calmed and the wreckage of the storm was surveyed, the devastation was staggering. The American Mulberry at Omaha, once a marvel of engineering and optimism, had been reduced to twisted metal and shattered concrete. The sea had torn through it without mercy. Phoenix caissons lay half-submerged like drowned fortresses. Whale roadways floated away like broken bridges, and spud pierheads had been ripped from their legs and sunk into the sand. Engineers walked the shoreline in silence, taking stock of the damage. Some wept openly. Others simply stared at the horizon, unable to accept that the harbor they had risked everything to build was gone. Yet in war, sentiment had no place. Orders soon came down from high command. Mulberry A was to be abandoned. The American divisions would instead rely on direct beach landings and, later, the capture of Cherbourg. The wrecked structures would serve as improvised breakwaters, protecting the shoreline even in death. Across the channel at Arromanches, the British Mulberry B had survived, but only just. Several Phoenix caissons had shifted under the relentless pounding, and the floating roadways had been twisted into grotesque angles. Yet the harbor still floated. It still worked. Engineers immediately set to repairing it, working waist-deep in freezing water, often under sniper fire from distant German positions. The wind had left the air bitter and damp, but the men did not stop. Naval officers, combat engineers, and civilian specialists joined together in the chaotic effort. Concrete was poured on the spot. Damaged caissons were patched with steel plates, and new mooring lines were secured with every resource available. Tugboats hauled drifting bombardons back into position. It was a race not against time, but against the tide. Day by day, Mulberry B was reborn. The men gave it a new name, Port Winston, in honor of the man whose stubborn imagination had made it possible. Within a week of the storm's passing, ships were once again unloading onto its floating piers. Liberty ships and coasters lined up to discharge their cargoes. Ammunition, tanks, food, and fuel flowed ashore in a steady rhythm. At its peak, Port Winston handled more than 6,000 tons of supplies per day, later exceeding 9,000 tons, more than the port of Dover itself. From this single floating harbor, the Allied armies were sustained. Every bullet fired in Normandy, every ration eaten, every gallon of petrol burned by tanks pushing inland, all of it passed across Mulberry Bay. For the soldiers on the beaches, it was nothing short of miraculous. In the middle of the sea, a city of steel stood against the elements. Columns of trucks rumbled down floating causeways. Cranes swung overhead, unloading crates of shells and barrels of fuel. Seagulls circled above while the channel wind carried the constant groan of engines and the slap of waves against concrete. The harbor became the heart of the invasion. Commanders who had once doubted its practicality now called it indispensable. Without the harbor at Arromanches, one logistics officer wrote, "We would have been forced to halt our advance within days." The Americans, though they had lost their Mulberry, still reaped its lessons. The remnants of their broken harbor served as a makeshift shield for the beaches of Omaha, calming the surf enough to allow continuous landing operations. With time, the captured port of Cherbourg would supplement the flow, but until then, Port Winston carried the burden alone. It did so with quiet endurance, an unyielding testament to the men who had built it. By July, as the Allied front began to push inland toward Caen and Saint-Lô, the significance of Mulberry became undeniable. It had turned the Normandy beaches into a living artery of war. More than 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies would eventually cross those beaches, most of them through the infrastructure that Mulberry made possible. The harbor was not just surviving, it was thriving. Its flexible wails bent with the waves but never broke. Its spud pier heads rose and fell with the tide. Day after day, like mechanical lungs breathing life into the invasion. Yet even triumph carried exhaustion. The men who maintained the harbor rarely slept more than a few hours. Every tide brought new repairs. The sea never relented. The salt never spared. Pumps ran constantly to keep the caissons dry, and crews fought corrosion as fiercely as soldiers fought the Wehrmacht. Many of them would never see combat medals or mention in dispatches. Their battle was invisible, fought in steel and salt water. By late summer, as Allied forces broke through the German lines in Operation Cobra and began their dash across France, Port Winston's role slowly diminished. New ports on the continent came into use, and the floating harbor that had carried the invasion began to fade from the headlines. But for those few critical months, it had been the hinge on which the liberation of Europe turned. The storm had tested the limits of human engineering, but it had also proven something greater, that courage and ingenuity could stand against even the most unforgiving elements. The Mulberry harbors had turned an impossible invasion into a sustained campaign. The tides had taken one, but the other had endured, and in its endurance, the fate of the war had shifted. When the last echoes of battle began to fade along the Normandy coast, the engineers finally allowed themselves to look back at what they had created. The Mulberry harbors were never meant to last more than a few months, yet their endurance defied every expectation. Especially Port Winston at Arromanches, battered, patched, and perpetually strained, had become the logistical heart of the Allied advance. In the weeks following D-Day, as Allied divisions pushed inland through the hedgerows of Normandy, the harbor became a living organism. Every sunrise saw ships lining up offshore, their hulls heavy with supplies. Every sunset brought the creak of floating roadways and the clang of winches still working long after dark. The rhythm of the harbor was the pulse of the campaign itself. From mid-June to late August 1944, Port Winston handled a staggering flow of cargo. Reports from the Royal Engineers recorded that more than 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and over 4 million tons of supplies passed through the Normandy beaches, the majority of them using Mulberry systems and breakwaters. Each day, between 6,000 and 9,000 tons of material poured ashore through Arromanches alone, enough to sustain multiple field armies. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and spare parts all traveled across its trembling steel roadways. Tanks rolled directly from ships to the front lines, while wounded soldiers were evacuated back along the same floating bridges. It was an unending cycle, one that kept the Allied war machine alive and moving. For the soldiers fighting in the bocage country beyond the beaches, Mulberry's success was invisible but absolute. The harbor ensured that reinforcements never ran dry, that fuel dumps were replenished, that artillery had shells to fire. Generals Eisenhower and Montgomery both acknowledged privately that without the artificial ports, Overlord would have stalled before the breakout from Normandy. The planners' fears that a lack of supply would choke the invasion never materialized. Logistics had triumphed over geography. Meanwhile, across the ruined coastline, remnants of Mulberry AE, the destroyed American harbor, still played a silent role. The wrecked Phoenix caissons at Omaha, though broken, formed a partial breakwater that calmed the surf. It allowed the Americans to continue landing supplies directly onto the beaches until Cherbourg was secured and repaired. In a sense, even in failure, the American harbor served its purpose. It had sacrificed itself to the storm so that the beaches might endure. By late July, as the Allied armies prepared for Operation Cobra, the great breakout from Normandy, the flow of supplies from Port Winston intensified once more. The harbor's capacity became the envy of every quartermaster. Without arrow-manches, one British logistics officer wrote, our spearheads would have run dry long before reaching Caen. The port's resilience astonished even its builders. Despite constant wear, corrosion, and bombardment, it operated continuously for 10 weeks without pause. Crews rotated in shifts, maintenance teams worked underwater, and tugs shuttled between damaged spans to keep the roadways open. Every storm that followed the Great Tempest of June was endured. None could finish what the Channel had begun. Eventually, as Cherbourg, Le Havre, and Antwerp came into Allied hands, the reliance on the artificial harbors began to wane. Yet even as new ports took over, Mulberry remained indispensable. The Allies had proven that an army could be supplied directly across open beaches, something once thought impossible. The lessons learned from those few months would shape amphibious doctrine for decades to come. For the men who had built and operated the harbor, the aftermath was a strange silence. The war rolled onward, leaving behind the skeletons of concrete caissons and rusted steel. Many of them returned to civilian life without recognition. Their creation had no medals or monuments, only the quiet satisfaction of having carried a continent on its back. But history would remember. The success of Mulberry was not measured in glory, but in survival. In every bullet fired inland, every tank refueled, every soldier fed because the sea had been conquered not by ships, but by engineering. By September 1944, the Allied advance across France had transformed the war's tempo. Paris was liberated, German lines were breaking, and the front now stretched hundreds of miles beyond the beaches where it had begun. Yet behind every movement of tanks and men was the lingering echo of Port Winston. Even as the artificial harbor's activity slowed, its legacy deepened. The engineers who had built it turned their expertise toward repairing captured ports, constructing temporary bridges, and restoring devastated harbors along the coast. The knowledge gained from Mulberry's trials, its strengths and failures alike, became the foundation for a new age of military logistics. For the Royal Engineers and Allied naval forces, the experience was transformative. The concept of modular, prefabricated, and transportable infrastructure had proven its worth beyond all doubt. Lessons from Mulberry were swiftly codified into manuals and technical papers. How to anchor floating structures under variable tide conditions, how to distribute stress across flexible spans, and how to build durable moorings in hostile seas. These insights would later influence post-war civil engineering, from floating docks to offshore oil platforms. In every harbor rebuilt in post-war Europe, echoes of Mulberry's design could be found. The legacy of necessity turned into innovation. The Germans, too, were forced to reckon with the genius of the project. After the war, captured German officers admitted that they had not believed such a feat possible. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt reportedly remarked that the Mulberry Harbors represented a victory of imagination. German engineers who studied the remains of the structures after the war were astonished by their sophistication, the scale, the precision, and the resilience that had defied the sea itself. The Atlantic Wall, once the pride of Nazi fortification, had been rendered irrelevant by a fleet of floating piers. Strategically, the Mulberry concept reshaped how future militaries approached amphibious warfare. The success of Port Winston proved that ports need not dictate strategy, that logistics could be mobile, adaptive, and inventive. It gave rise to a doctrine of engineering first, where mobility and sustainment became as crucial as firepower. The United States Navy, having learned bitter lessons from Mulberry A's destruction, invested heavily in new portable docking and causeway systems. Britain continued refining floating bridge and harbor technologies, which later found use during the Korean War and even in humanitarian relief operations decades later. In Britain, the story of Mulberry slowly entered the public consciousness. The secrecy surrounding its creation had meant few outside military circles knew the scale of what had been achieved. When photographs and reports were finally released, the public marveled at the audacity of the idea. A harbor built on the sea, moved across a storm-tossed channel, and assembled in a war zone. Engineers who had spent the war in anonymity found themselves briefly celebrated, though most returned to quiet civilian lives. For them, the greatest reward was knowing that their creation had shortened the war, saved lives, and proven that British industry and ingenuity could still astonish the world. In France, the remains of Port Winston were never completely dismantled. Some Phoenix caissons were repurposed for coastal defense or flood protection. Others simply left where they sank, half buried in sand and seaweed. Even today, when the tide retreats at Arromanches, the ghostly outlines of the harbor emerge from the surf, a skeletal reminder of a moment when human invention conquered both war and water. They stand silent, streaked with rust and barnacles, their massive forms softened by time, yet still defiant against the waves. For historians, the true measure of Mulberry's success lies not only in its survival, but in its symbolism. It was the embodiment of Allied cooperation, British design, American resources, Canadian manpower, and shared purpose bound together by the belief that no obstacle, not even the sea, was insurmountable. It was the quiet victory beneath the roar of D-Day, the bridge that connected hope to liberation. As Europe began to rebuild from the ruins of war, the lessons of Mulberry endured. It had shown that victory was not only a matter of courage or strategy, but of creativity, the kind that turns impossibility into reality. The sea off Normandy is quiet now. Waves lap gently against the weathered remains of concrete giants, the last relics of Port Winston. Gulls rest on their surfaces, unaware that beneath their feet lies one of the greatest achievements of human ingenuity. The Mulberry Harbor, conceived in secrecy, built through desperation, and tested by the fury of nature, endures as both monument and metaphor. It represents what can be achieved when imagination and necessity converge in the crucible of war. History remembers the battles, the generals, and the victories. But behind every flag raised on the continent was a chain of effort. Welders in Scottish shipyards, engineers in muddy test pools, sailors steering tugboats through storms. They were not driven by glory, but by a quiet conviction that something impossible had to be made real. In the balance between destruction and creation, Mulberry stood firmly on the side of creation. It turned the sea, once the greatest obstacle to liberation, into a bridge. Its legacy extends beyond military triumph. Mulberry proved that war could also be a workshop for ideas that outlived the conflict itself. The principles of modular construction, floating stability, and rapid deployment born here would later shape peacetime innovation, from harbor design to offshore engineering. What began as an answer to invasion became a blueprint for rebuilding. In the end, the story of the invisible harbor is not just about steel and concrete. It is about vision, the courage to defy convention, to build hope where none should exist. It reminds us that victory is not only won by those who charge forward under fire, but also by those who stand behind them, shaping the world that makes such courage possible. As the tide rises over the ghosts of Arromanches, the sea hides the work of men who refuse to let the impossible stay impossible. Their harbor may have vanished into history, but its spirit endures, a quiet, unbroken testament to human resolve.